Uluma was born into a family bound to the royal palace of a powerful kingdom. Her ancestors had once been free spirit walkers who could use shadow magic, dream magic, and healing rituals. But many generations ago, the king captured them and forced their bloodline into eternal servitude. The royal curse placed upon them ensured that they could not escape the kingdom. Any member of the family who attempted to leave the land died painfully before reaching the border. The gifted family also never agreed to kill the king. It had crossed some of their minds, but since they had been brainwashed for centuries that their sole purpose was to serve kings, they never tried killing any king. But the royal family did not extend the same grace to them. The royal family used their powers relentlessly. Each time the magic was used, the sorcerers lost their life force and died young. The royal family knew that overusing the gifted family's powers could kill the family, but that did not stop them. Instead, they forced the gifted family to mate with each other in order to birth more gifted children. Uluma grew up watching her parents slowly weaken from constant magical use, but she had no choice. Once she gained her powers, she would have to use her power every day just to serve the wicked king that ruled in her home. This was the life that the gods had chosen for her. She knew she had no other choice. When Uluma turned 16, the change began. It happened during the night. When she laid on the sleeping mat beside her younger cousins, her shadow suddenly hit the wall. Uluma sat up, but the shadow did not follow her lead. Instead, it slid across the wall and reached the roof. Uluma stared at it as she grew afraid. She got up and walked towards the wall, but as she approached it, the shadow slipped away. It moved along the wall of the corridor. Uluma ran after it when it started moving too fast. The shadow crossed the courtyard of the servants' quarters. It slipped over the ground and climbed the outer wall of the compound. Uluma stopped at the gate. Her legs refused to move farther, but the shadow continued moving. Her shadow disappeared into the darkness before her eyes. Uluma collapsed onto the ground, shaking as foam poured out of her mouth. Inside the palace, another servant slept beside the kitchen fires. The shadow entered the room through the open doorway. It stretched along the floor and climbed the servant's body. It reached the man's face and slipped into his eyes. The servant's breathing slowed. Inside the dream, Uluma stood in a wide field. The servant walked through the field carrying a basket of fruit. He hummed quietly and moved toward a small house. Uluma watched him from a distance. She did not understand what she was seeing. The dream shifted. The servant placed the basket on a table and spoke to someone Uluma could not see. She tried to move closer, but the dream suddenly broke apart. Uluma felt herself pulled backward. Her shadow rushed out of the man's body and returned through the darkness. Uluma gasped awake in the courtyard. Her hands shook violently. Her aunt found her on the ground and lifted her quickly. Uluma was carried back inside. Her family gathered around her mat. No one spoke for a long time. Then her grandmother pressed her hand against Uluma's chest. The old woman nodded slowly to the rest of the family that was present. She confirmed that the power had awakened. The next morning, the royal guards arrived. The king had already been informed about Uluma's powers and had sent the royal diviners to do their job. Uluma was taken to the inner palace before the sun rose. 2 guards walked beside her. Another walked behind her. Uluma kept her eyes on the ground while they crossed the stone courtyard and entered the Hall of Magic. The royal diviners waited inside. Uluma stood in the center of the room while they placed lamps around her. The flames lit the floor. One of the diviners drew a circle of ash around Uluma's feet. Another diviner placed a knife in her hand. She was instructed to cut her palm, which she did obediently. Blood fell onto the floor. The diviners began chanting. The lamps flickered. Uluma's shadow moved again. This time, it stretched across the floor and rose along the walls. The diviners watched closely. One of them clapped loudly. Uluma's shadow slid along the ground and entered the body of a guard sitting somewhere outside. The guard fell into a deep sleep immediately. Inside the dream, Uluma appeared in a narrow hallway. She saw the guard walking through the hallway carrying a spear. Uluma followed him. She watched his memories move around her. She saw the palace gates, soldiers marching, and prisoners being dragged through the courtyard. The diviners pulled her out of the dream before she could see more. Uluma collapsed again, foam pouring down from her mouth. The king heard about the test before the hour ended. Uluma was summoned to the throne room. She knelt before the throne while the diviners explained her power. The king listened without speaking. He stood slowly and walked down the steps. He stopped in front of Uluma and lifted her chin. Then, he ordered the diviners to prepare the dream chamber. From that night, Uluma's work began. Every evening, she was brought into the chamber. A bowl of black powder was burned beside her mat. The smoke filled the room. Uluma lay down while the diviners drew marks across her arms. A name was given. Uluma's shadow slipped into the dream of whoever the king wanted to watch. Sometimes it was a noble. Sometimes it was a soldier. Sometimes it was a merchant suspected of betrayal. Uluma walked through dreams every night. She watched meetings in secret rooms. She saw coins exchanged between enemies. She saw soldiers whispering plans. Each morning, she reported everything she saw. The king used the information quickly. Soldiers were arrested before noon. Merchants disappeared before sunset. Entire households were dragged away after Uluma's dream reports. But the work did not stop. The king demanded more dreams. Uluma entered 3 dreams each night. Then it rose to 5 and then 7. Her shadow moved across the palace constantly. Each time she returned to her body, she felt something missing. First, it was small things. She stopped laughing with her family. She stopped crying when her father collapsed from exhaustion. Her mother noticed first. One evening, Uluma sat beside the cooking fire while her younger brother tripped and fell hard onto the ground. The boy cried loudly. Uluma watched him, and she did not move to help him. Her mother rushed forward and lifted the boy while staring at Uluma in silence. More nights passed. Uluma entered the dreams of strangers. She watched murders, secrets, betrayals, and fears. She saw nightmares and felt nothing. The rest of the family saw that she had changed. They could not understand her because overusing their powers made them weaker. But in Uluma's case, she was getting cold, as though she was not human. Some of them started avoiding her in fear. Her grandmother began praying over her each morning. The old woman placed her hands on Uluma's head and whispered ancient words. But the prayers did not stop the change. One night, Uluma entered the dream of a nobleman. Inside the dream, the man killed his brother, a friend to the king. Uluma watched the knife enter the body again and again. The dream repeated the act over and over. Uluma stood there watching without blinking. When she woke up, the diviners asked what she saw. Uluma told them calmly. The nobleman was executed that afternoon. Weeks passed. The king increased the work again. Uluma entered 10 dreams in a single night. When she woke up, she sat up slowly and stared at the chamber walls. One of the diviners waved a hand in front of her face. Uluma did not react for several seconds. Something inside her had become quiet. That night, she returned to her family quarters. Her cousins laughed and played with carved wooden toys. Uluma sat beside them. One of the children pushed a toy toward her. Uluma looked at it. Then she pushed it away, stating that she did not wish to be disturbed. Her grandmother watched her carefully, hoping that the playful Uluma she knew before would come back. Later that night, the old woman decided to speak to Uluma's mother. Both women stood outside under the moon. They watched Uluma sitting alone inside the hut. The old woman shook her head slowly. Each dream was taking a piece of Uluma, and the king had no intention of stopping. The palace slept while Uluma continued working. The dream chamber doors opened before sunrise. Guards entered and ordered her to stand. Uluma rose slowly from the mat. The markings on her arms remained dark. The black powder bowl still burned beside the wall. A diviner inspected her eyes. Another pressed 2 fingers against her wrist. She looked visibly sick. The diviner led her out of the chambers. Guards followed as Uluma walked through the long corridors without lifting her head. Servants stepped aside quickly when they saw her approaching. Some bowed in fear. Others turned away and pretended to clean the floors. Uluma's presence caused a lot of fear in the kingdom, most especially the palace. Everyone was on their toes, worried that Uluma was going to visit their dreams next. The guards escorted her across the inner courtyard and toward the servants' quarters. Uluma moved slowly. Her steps dragged slightly against the stone floor. She felt lightheaded, tired, and drained. From the balcony above the courtyard, someone actively watched her, just like he did every other day. It was the crowned prince. He stood near the railing, observing carefully. He had been awake long before sunrise. He watched the guards escort Uluma across the courtyard. He noticed the way she walked. Her shoulders leaned forward. Her head remained low. Her steps slowed several times before the guards pushed her forward again. The prince remained still as they passed beneath the balcony. Uluma disappeared into the servants' corridor. The prince turned away and walked back into the palace hall. Later that morning, the prince entered the throne room. The king sat on the throne while nobles stood in a half-circle around him. The diviners knelt beside the throne, holding scrolls filled with reports. One diviner spoke while pointing at a name written on the parchment. The king listened and nodded. Guards dragged a prisoner into the hall. The prisoner struggled while chains scraped against the floor. The diviner pointed to another line on the scroll as he continued reading. The king raised his hand to dismiss the prisoners. He was in no mood to listen to prisoners beg for mercy. His attention was centered on what the diviner had to say. So the guards dragged the prisoner away again. The prince watched the entire scene from the side of the room. The diviner continued speaking while pointing to different names. The king gave more orders. Soldiers entered and left repeatedly. But the prince noticed one thing. Uluma's name was said several times. She was the most used gifted person in her lineage. How much more pressure could she take before dying? At this rate, it was going to be impossible for her to get to 30 years of age. Later that day, the prince walked through the palace corridors. Servants bowed as he passed. Guards moved aside. He stopped outside the Hall of Magic. 2 guards stood outside the doors. The prince commanded they step aside and said that he wanted to stand by the door to watch what was going on. The guards did as they were told. He watched briefly as the diviners were preparing another ritual before walking away. That evening, the dream chamber doors opened again as Uluma entered with 2 guards beside her. She walked directly to the mat and knelt. The diviners placed the bowl of black powder beside her again. Smoke filled the room. One diviner took Uluma's hand and reopened the cut on her palm. Blood dripped onto the floor. The diviners drew fresh markings across her arms. A name was spoken. Uluma laid back on the mat. Her shadow stretched across the floor. It slipped along the walls and disappeared. Hours passed as Uluma continued working. The prince passed by the chamber late that night. He had become interested in watching Uluma's powers. On a regular day, he refused to watch the gifted family get used. It seemed unjust to him, seeing his father use those people the way he did. He was not as wicked as his father and had been threatened many times by his father that he had better man up, or else he would not inherit the throne. He watched Uluma be used like a slave inside of the chambers. He was unable to watch that for a long time and left after a few minutes. The following night, the same routine continued. Uluma entered the chamber again and the same power draining occurred. They did not care that she was getting lean and sick. Later that night, Uluma was escorted back toward the servants' quarters. The guards moved quickly through the corridor. Uluma's steps slowed again. Her legs trembled. One guard pushed her forward to keep moving. Uluma stumbled slightly but kept walking. The prince entered the corridor from the opposite side. The guards stopped immediately when they saw him. They lowered their heads. Uluma stopped walking as well. Her head remained lowered, though she felt very uncomfortable. The prince stood still for several seconds, looking at Uluma. Her arms hung loosely at her sides. The cuts on her palms remained fresh. The prince stepped closer to her. One guard moved slightly as if preparing to explain something, but the prince raised a hand, and the guard fell silent. The prince stepped around her and continued walking. The guards resumed their movement. escorting Uluma away. The following day, the prince entered the royal archives. He walked between the tall shelves while servants cleaned the floors nearby. He stopped at a table where several scrolls had been placed. One scroll contained the reports from the diviners. The prince opened it slowly and read through the names. He saw how extensively Uluma was used, and the current state of her health was written as poor on the scroll. So, they knew she was unwell but kept using her. The prince took great pity upon her. He read the number of dreams assigned to Uluma every night. He read the notes written by the diviners. He saw the record of executions connected to her visions. He saw the record of her health growing worse. He rolled the scroll shut and placed it back on the table. The prince left the archive and walked through the palace halls. Guards bowed as he passed. Servants stepped aside quickly. He stopped outside the dream chamber again, and this time he forced himself to watch the entire scene of Uluma being slaved away. The guards guarding the door lowered their heads when he gestured for them to open the door. They hesitated briefly but obeyed. The prince stepped inside. Uluma lay on the mat while the diviners stood around her. The bowl of black powder burned beside her. The smoke filled the chamber. One diviner pressed a knife against Uluma's palm and reopened the cut. Blood fell onto the floor again. Another diviner drew new markings along her arms. Uluma did not resist. Her eyes remained fixed on the ceiling. The prince stood quietly beside the door and watched. A name was spoken. Uluma's shadow stretched along the floor and moved toward the wall. It climbed upward and disappeared. Minutes passed. The diviners waited. Uluma's body trembled slightly on the mat. After a long moment, her shadow returned. Uluma gasped and sat upright. Foam slipped from the corner of her mouth. A diviner stepped closer and demanded the dream report, which she gave before collapsing again. The cycle was repeated over and over until Uluma was unable to move any longer. The next day, he entered the royal archives again. He opened another scroll containing the dream reports. That same night, Uluma returned to the dream chamber again to carry out the orders of the diviners, which had come from the king himself. Uluma's shadow left her body again, but this time something changed. Her shadow slipped into a dream that felt different from the others. Inside the dream, Uluma appeared in a large courtyard. She walked forward slowly. Footsteps echoed behind her. She turned around and saw the crown prince standing in the dream. He did not commit a crime like the other dream figures she had seen before. He only stood still, watching her. Unlike the rest, he seemed fully aware of Uluma's presence. She stepped back as her shadow flickered. She tried to force herself out of the dream and succeeded. The diviners stepped closer immediately. They demanded the dream report. Uluma lied quickly and avoided mentioning the prince. The diviners wrote down her report and began preparing the next ritual. This time, Uluma did not see the prince. But the next night, she saw him again. This time, she found the prince walking across the palace gardens inside the dream. He stopped walking when he noticed her shadow standing behind him. Uluma remained still. The prince turned fully toward her and was about to speak to her, but Uluma forced herself out of the dream again. From that night, whenever Uluma entered people's dreams, she saw the prince before waking up. How was he able to do that? The prince began arriving more deliberately. He did not force her to speak. He simply appeared, observing, as if giving her space to exist freely in a way the waking world would never allow. As time went on, she began to feel comfortable in his presence and carried out her duties in the dreams as she always had, since the other characters in the dream were not self-aware like she and the prince. The prince learned more of her, too, as he followed her shadows everywhere in the dream. And sometimes, in the real world, he stalked her without anyone noticing. One night, he acted differently. He walked toward her, his shadow brushing across hers in a way that startled her. For the first time in a long while, she attempted to smile. She felt different. As time went on, they began to talk to each other in the dreams. Uluma asked how he was able to always appear in her dreams consciously. He told her that whenever he thought about her deeply before sleeping, he was able to enter her dream. He explained that it could be fate. But how could it be when Uluma was merely a servant? It was impossible for them to love each other, but they did regardless. In the waking world, the prince's actions grew bold. He began spending hours in the royal archives, reading forbidden scrolls and uncovering records long hidden from ordinary eyes. He discovered accounts of Uluma's family. He traced the betrayal of the royal ancestors, the sealing of the spirit beneath the land, and the origin of the curse that bound Uluma's lineage to servitude. The curse's rules were merciless. The rules included death beyond the kingdom's borders, loss of identity through overuse of magic, and endless servitude enforced by fear and blood. But buried in the ancient texts, he found the truth that the curse could be broken, though the path required a king or his heir to willingly surrender the power stolen from her ancestors. All he needed to do was to find the ritual right. Although they did not say much to each other in real life and behaved like strangers, in the dream world, the bond between them deepened. She began to laugh softly in dreams, a sound her family or anyone at the palace had not heard for decades. At one point, she broke down, explaining that the dreams were slowly hurting her. She felt slightly relieved when the prince pulled her into a hug and kissed her. It had also been quite a while since she cried. Spending time with the prince made her feel more human. The next day, he anonymously sent drugs to her so she could get well physically. Although her family thought the gods were trying to help her, she knew where she got that help from. But still, every night brought a cost. Each return to her body in the waking world drained her further. Her hands shook, her vision blurred, and her bones ached from the unnatural extension of her powers. All she could think about was ways she could perhaps kill the king or run away. She had no idea that the prince was doing research of his own. The prince's love grew. It was no longer pity or curiosity. He loved her for who she was. He continued to send medications and gifts to her discreetly. In the dreams, he reached toward her shadow more boldly, letting their shadows touch. Slowly, she began to allow herself to trust him, even though it increased the risk of getting exposed. But Uluma's fear never left. Loving him could doom her family because she stayed longer in the dreams after work. So, when she returned from dreams each night, her body weakened further, even though she was getting happier. Her family had also noticed her happiness. It made them happy, even though she looked like she was dying off bit by bit. The prince, relentlessly, began planning for a better future with Uluma, even though she was a servant. He was deeply in love with her and could not continue watching her suffer. He continued his search for the ritual to carry out to end Uluma and her family's suffering. His father, the king, was not a fool. He had hidden the ritual where it was nearly impossible for anyone to find, including his son. As the prince searched for the ritual, the king continued his relentless demand. Aluma's nights were filled with the visions of crime and treachery, murder and conspiracy, draining her life force even as she gained a bit of control in secret. Finally, the prince uncovered the ritual process to challenge the curse. There were many steps to take, but the prince knew he had to do them for the girl he loved. He also knew that any misstep would be fatal, not just for him, but for Uluma and her family. Sometimes he had to carry out the ritual steps alone, and sometimes he had to do that with Uluma in her dreams. They mimicked the gestures of surrendering. They mixed their bloods and prayed to the gods of the land. When Uluma realized that the prince was carrying out these rituals to set her family free, she was so happy that she kissed him deeply. During the process of the ritual, Uluma learned to shape her power with precision, to extend her shadow, and reduce the risk of death. In the real world, their love started getting dangerous because the people at the palace began to suspect them. The prince was kind to her. It was unheard of for the royal family to be kind to Uluma's family, ever. Also, another reason people began to get suspicious was because the prince began to interfere subtly in the palace, moving documents and questioning advisors and other orders of the palace. Nothing could stay hidden within the walls of the palace for too long. It was only a matter of time before the king figured out what was going on between the prince and Uluma. At first, he was suspicious that the prince, who wanted nothing to do with Uluma's family because he felt great pity for them, began involving himself in the matters of Uluma. At first, the king had brushed it off. But after a long while of suspecting, one night the king realized Uluma has been entering the prince's dreams too often, because he had ordered his court diviners to watch her closely. They realized she had been lying and altering activities that occurred in her dreams. They reported to the king, and after a few days of investigation, the king found out that the prince met with Uluma in the dream. He was furious and believed that Uluma was manipulating the prince. What he did not know was that the prince was almost done performing the rituals to set Uluma and her family free. He was smart in his plans. Since he was from a royal family that could read and write, he had rewritten all the ritual processes and had left the original scroll back in his father's chambers where he had found it, so that even when his father went to check if the prince had taken the scroll, he found it right where he left it and did not suspect to that extent. Usually, when the king found no use for a member of the gifted family, he made sure they mated and brought forth a child before letting them die, but that was not the case with Uluma. The wicked king announced that he no longer needed Uluma and asked for her execution the next day, for fear of getting overpowered. He knew that Uluma was the most powerful in her lineage, and now that her loyalty was compromised, he feared death or worse. The prince tried to protest, but the king got him locked up in his room. The prince worked harder to complete the ritual before it became too late. According to the king's orders, Uluma was not allowed to close her eyes because he was afraid that she would slip into his dreams. He had every reason to be afraid because, unlike the rest of her lineage, Uluma felt a strong hatred towards the king and wanted him dead. She did not have the enslaved mentality like the rest of her family. She wanted to be free. She was locked up separately from her family, who prayed for her fervently, hoping for a miracle to happen even though they knew that once the present king passed an order, he never went back on his words. What nobody knew was that Uluma could go into people's dreams without closing her eyes or laying down. She had gained an amount of stability over her powers since the prince started performing the rituals. So, when the guards took their eyes off her for a few minutes, her shadow left her and made its way into the king's dream. He was unaware of her presence as she watched him, finding him full of evil and obsessed with power even in his dream. His dream was one of the worst dreams she had ever entered. She wanted to kill him on the spot, but she thought of the prince. Did he hate his father enough to want him dead? Since Uluma loved the prince and did not want him to be sad, she did not kill his father, the king. Instead, she weakened his shadow, which would weaken his flesh for a short period of time, she thought. She weakened his shadow before she had to rush back to her body, so that the guards would not notice that she was not fully conscious as she was seated in the room. The next day was the execution day, and Uluma was brought before the entire village, as it was to be a public death to show everyone the consequences of being disloyal. The king had sent guards to bring the prince to watch the execution of Uluma. He had no idea that the prince had spent the entire night completing the ritual process, and that was also the reason Uluma was not as scared as everyone expected her to be. She knew that the prince would save her. Before the execution could be carried out, the prince began fake crying, asking his father if he could make a little speech. The king smiled, thinking he had crushed his son's spirit, but when the prince began to speak, the king's smile dropped. The prince announced in front of everyone, including the gifted family who were also present to witness Uluma's death, that they were finally free of the curse. When the king commanded his guards to seize the prince and lock him up like a prisoner, the prince's loyal guards stood by him, refusing the king's guard to take their prince. The king got up to kill Uluma himself, but suddenly got a heart attack and died before he could get help from the diviner. Uluma pretended to not have known that she could have been the one behind his death. She had weakened his spirit, body, and soul through his shadows, and even though it was not to kill him but to torture him, he still died. The gifted family were finally free to live their lives normally. The prince got married to Uluma, although she never remained completely human and could not fully express all human emotions when she needed to. She retained her powers of walking into dreams, but used it for only good. She no longer got sick from using her powers because she did not use it frequently. They both ruled the land happily, and the palace became a safe space for many.